Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 425 show. My name is Bailey Bursick, and we're here with an exciting episode on risk-based conditional access. I know a lot of folks have been curious about this, especially on how to roll it out. What do all the risk detection mean? What do all the risk detections mean? And things of that nature. Today, we have Rashi Kuke and Megan Walsh, who are two product managers that have been working on this for quite some time. So I'll hand it off to Rashi to get us started and learn more about it.
Awesome. Thank you for joining. Today's agenda is as follows. We will start with the risk landscape. We will dive into what Entra ID protection is. I will hand it over to Megan to talk about the risk detections, automation, and remediation, and we'll wrap up with some deployment steps. So moving on to the next slide, here's an infographic that Microsoft Defense Report of 2024 has produced. This infographic shows that 99% of the identity attacks today are password-based. And this is largely due to the predictable nature of humans, such as weak or reused passwords, reusing them across multiple sites, and being susceptible to phishing attacks. Now, the key takeaway here is that while identity compromises remain a significant risk, only a small percent of the attacks, less than 1%, really bypass MFA or exploit authentication vulnerabilities. Now, this tells us that a layered authentication method can make a huge difference in preventing these type of attacks. Moving on to the next slide, given that this landscape, it's very clear why protection identities is essential. Attackers are becoming more sophisticated and a proactive approach is very required. To give you an example, Microsoft Entra data shows that password attacks dominate about 600 million identity threats daily. Microsoft also has blocked about an average about 7,000 password attacks per second, which highlights the persistent scale of these threat attacks. Now, this is why identity protection really matters. Solutions that prevent identity compromise are critical in today's threat landscape. And this is where identity protection comes into play. It prevents identity compromise by blocking identity takeover in real time. It uses advanced detection techniques to analyze risk, stop unauthorized access at any point of sign-in. And with adaptive policies, we can enforce security controls based on real-time risk. For example, if your user is a risky user, you may trigger an additional MFA requirement, or you could also block access. Now, this really ensures that only legitimate users are able to access, and it's seamless integration with other Microsoft tools. So identity protection is not just about monitoring, it's about proactively defending against identity compromises in real time. So how does this really work? Entra ID protection analyzes trillions of signals, checks for anomalies, risky behaviors. It flags any suspicious activities and reports any risky identities that might have been compromised. And we have the signals coming in from the three main sources. The first one that we have is the auto-generated signals, and those are our high-quality ML detections. We also get detections from first parties. The second source is our expert-generated signals, which are dedicated teams of security researchers and human labelers to investigate and identify attack patterns and compromises. And having access to these huge signals is an asset to Microsoft products. Third is the end user generated signals. Our algorithms learn and adapt based on real feedback to improve in precision. Now, with these signals, our risk evaluation engine, which is also based on a machine learning model, will be able to calculate risk levels for the identities, and then risky users, risky sign-ins, risky workload identities will be reported. Now, with these risk insights, you will be able to do a lot, from securing user access to investigation. You can implement dynamic risk-based conditional access policies, which we'll get into in just a little bit, to block bad actors while also allowing good users to remediate. And that gives you a healthy balance between protection, security, as well as user convenience. You can investigate, remediate risk by taking a look at the risk report. And as I called out before, identity protection, Entra ID protection is also seamlessly integrated with Microsoft security products such as Defender and Sentinel. You can also export these to third-party tools. Now, with that, I'll hand it over to Megan from the product team to dive deep into the risk detections.
Thank you, Rashi. I want to spend a little bit of time just diving into what our risk detections are and how they work, because they're really, the really unique identifier Microsoft has is all of these signals, these trillions of signals that we're getting every day, and how we can, use them to really pinpoint risk in your environment. So the biggest part of our detections is our machine learning models. These are, PI to Microsoft. So this graph here, it doesn't reflect the actual weight of the model, but it gives a good example of how we train our models and the different indicators we have. A lot of our models have thousands of different indicators and labels that we use to determine the risk on an account. And all of those labels have different weights. So for our imaginary ML model here, we're looking at different things like, is this a normal time of day for this user to be signing in? Are they coming from a familiar device? Is the app they're signing into familiar? Is the IP familiar? Is the country familiar? So a bunch of different familiarity metrics we have for each user and each tenant that we're able to put these all together to determine if it's the good user or an attacker trying to get into the system. And these weights, they each weigh differently. For something saying, is it coming from a familiar location? Me signing in from Bellevue one day versus Redmond, that wouldn't have as much weight in the model as if I was signing in from New York City when I normally sign in from Redmond. So these models are super dynamic and able to change these weights and are very, very nuanced when it comes to us determining risk. So let's look at how, we have all these signals. How do we aggregate them into risk events, risky sign-ins, and risky users? So each user or workload identity has an aggregate risk level based on the historical sign-in activity and offline detections. This is at the very top. This is the user risk. So the overall riskiness that this user, that there's someone outside of this user has access to this user's account. Each sign-in that occurs is assessed for risk in real time based off of multiple factors. So these are those risk events here at the bottom. These ML models are running on every single sign-in in Microsoft Entra. So even if risk-based conditional access isn't turned on, we are still assessing risk for every single sign-in. And this all happens before a token is issued. So as soon as a user hits sign in after putting in their password or using any other credential, we're going through and just checking if this is risky. So this is all running very, very fast in real time. And when we detect risk on a sign-in, we log a risky sign-in for that. So all these risk detections that are coming in, we will issue them for a specific sign-in. And then the combination of all these risk events, all these risky sign-ins, all these risk detections culminate into user risk. So the user risk is going to be the highest level of risk that we find for that user. So if they maybe had a low risk sign-in, but they get a high risk offline detection, they will be a high risk user and vice versa. So very much kind of bringing everything together to tell you what the overall risk that someone besides the intended user has access to this account. And here's just a little sampling of some of the risk detections that we're running in Entra. We have an AKA link at the bottom where you can go to our documentation and see all of our current detections. But we're kind of lumped into a few groups. Our detections are either running real time, so this is during sign-in, before a token is issued. We are running things like unfamiliar sign-in properties to see that familiarity of the sign-in. We're seeing if this is coming from an anonymous or malicious IP address. So checking that IP address. Basically, any information that Microsoft gets at the time of sign-in, we're running that to see if there's any risk involved with that particular sign-in. We also have a bunch of offline detections. So for things that happen suspiciously out of band of a sign-in, or when we just get more data, we can elevate the risk of a user that way. So those are things like leak credentials, where we're getting username and password pairs from on the dark web from law enforcement officials and from internal threat hunters at Microsoft. Whenever we see that a username and password pair for a user is somewhere on the dark web, we mark that user as high risk of takeover, so you can remediate it. We are also looking for password spray attacks, different token-based attacks, token issuer anomaly. In that graph that Rashi showed, we see that these kind of, more advanced token-based threats are in that small sliver of the 1% of things we see. But for a very sophisticated organization that has strong authentication, they have MFA enabled, these token-based attacks are what these attackers are pivoting to. So those are something super important that we're running within Entra. We also have Microsoft Entra Threat Intelligence. These are detections that are made quickly by our threat researchers within Microsoft. So both our Mystic team and our identity threat hunters, they can very quickly spin up a new detection whenever they see something suspicious happening in any environment, and then deploy that quickly. So if we see, a spike in password sprays coming from a particular tool that attackers are using, we can put out a rule in a detection very quickly through threat intelligence. And these ones with an asterisk here are things we're getting from our friends in Defender. So suspicious inbox forwarding, mass access to sensitive files, those are things we don't necessarily think a good user is going to be doing, and are signs of that user is compromised and a threat actor has access. And then these detections are also either linked to a sign-in or linked to a user. So that's sign-in risk or user risk. We've talked about most of these before in the previous set, but during sign-in, these are things like anonymous token, unfamiliar sign-in properties, and impossible travel, which we're getting from our friends in Defender. And linked to a user can support suspicious activity on their own if they go to My Sign-ins and they go, oh wait, that wasn't me. I wasn't signing in from that location. They can report that, and we link that to the user, as well as those other detections we talked about for offline. So let's run through an example here of how we determine a risk level for a user. All of our risk that we present to customers is in low, medium, or high. And all of our detections, some of them only fire at high, some can fire at any different severity. So let's kind of go through an example here for our user who they are a IT director and they've last signed in from Quantico, Virginia 5 hours ago. We're seeing them sign into iOS, they're using modern auth, and all of this checks out for what normal behavior is for this user. But then we see that they've signed in from Italy, wish I was there, but there's been multiple sign-in attempts. So we can kind of gauge here that this isn't our IT director who's signing in, getting to Italy within 5 hours from Virginia, and then trying to sign in multiple times. That's something that we think is a medium risk of account takeover. So we would raise their sign-in risk up to medium whenever we saw that sign-in come through. Our next user here is a logistics supervisor. We saw them 5 hours ago in San Diego. They are logging in on an Android device, going into Outlook, but we see that their IP address is coming from an anonymous IP, so maybe a Tor browser. And for that, we raise them up to medium risk because that's suspicious. But then we also find that their credentials were leaked on the dark web. And so we're going to raise their user risk up to high. So overall, this user is going to be challenged at sign-in for their anonymous, or they can be challenged at sign-in with risk-based conditional access, which we'll get to, for their anonymous IP address. And then they can be challenged, to change their password on their next sign-in because of their user risk level. And finally, looking at a passwordless user scenario here. So the same logistics supervisor, they're signing in on Windows, and they're doing Outlook Mobile, but we see kind of offline, or we see online anomalous token. This is something that doesn't, maybe they're signing in, they had a token issued, they're signing in with an older token somewhere else. That's risky. And then we get a detection from Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, saying that there's an attempt to access a primary refresh token. So we will move that user level up to high. So neither of these token-based attacks are password-based. So even if this user is not using their password, they're using Authenticator app, we can still catch that. Or even with CBA, for example. So we're able to catch these token-based attacks outside of a sign-in. So let's go through a little demo of how we report these risk detections in our portal. So you can access these risk detections in the Entra Admin Center from protection, either from risky activities or identity protection at the top of the list there. And so we have reports for risky users, risky sign-ins, risky workload identities, and just pure risk detections. So looking at some risky sign-ins here, we see that this user has 2 risky sign-ins, one from Paris, France, and one from Germany. And we can click in and see all of the information about this risk, what risk level it was, where the source is, sign-in client, who issued the token. And then we have options where an admin can confirm the sign-in is safe, dismiss it, or mark as compromised. So we would want to mark the sign-in as compromised if I know this user, wasn't in France at the time. And what this will do is this will feed back to our machine learning engine, and we'll learn from that and learn like, hey, this user doesn't come in from France. We should be on more high alert whenever we see these types of risk detections and these attributes coming from this user. We're also going to look at this recent risky sign-ins, the recent risky sign-ins for this user, and again, confirm that that is compromised. We can even go a step further and block the user so that this user cannot sign in anymore, or we can reset their password for them. With the risky user, we recommend resetting password because of password-based attacks are very common. And so this looks like an attacker may have their password. So we will reset their password and then dismiss that risk. One thing I would like to note here is that these, the confirm users compromise, confirm user safe, dismiss user risk, we use all of those in our machine learning engine. Confirming a user's compromise will take those attributes and feed back in and say, hey, this is a true positive compromise, as well as marking that user at high risk for sign-in and user risk. Confirming a user safe will help our machine learning model learn what the normal usage for that is. We see a lot of customers use this if they're using VPN providers. So we'll see one single user kind of bouncing around from different locations and different IP addresses. If we confirm that user safe, we will start to familiarize those IP addresses with that user and with the tenant. So if we're seeing, everyone in the company is on the same VPN provider, it's confirming those IPs as safe, we'll start to familiarize that for the tenant and kind of stop these risk detections that are kind of false positives from coming through. And dismissing user risk is kind of just like an X button in the corner. You're getting rid of it. It's not really feeding back positively or negatively into our machine learning models with those attributes. So moving forward here, now that we've really dug into all of our risk detections, which is fantastic if you just want to go through and see what the risk is in your tenant, do some threat hunting and investigations. That is fantastic. But one of the best ways to use our detections is for automatic protection and remediation. It is great if you can go into a dashboard every now and again and go, oh, shoot, this user's credentials were leaked. But who knows how long that threat actor has been in your environment. With automatic protection and remediation, users aren't blocked whenever they kind of have that risk detection, and also they can prove that they are them, the good user, by doing MFA or resetting their passwords so it doesn't disrupt productivity. So this is really kind of stopping those attackers from getting into your system by having these policies, as well as if you get a false positive, a good user can get through easily. So risk-based conditional access is how we kind of use these risk detections with our policy engine of conditional access to get all of that goodness I just mentioned. So using these, it has enhanced security posture because you're stopping those attackers from getting into your environment in the first place. You can auto remediate risky users and sign-ins. So that is when that good user, maybe I'm on vacation and I'm signing in from somewhere nice and sunny instead of Seattle. I'll get an MFA prompt and I can easily remediate that on my end without having to get help desk or admin involved. And it provides insights on the ML models. If I am someone who lives between two locations or I travel often, the ML model will start to understand that and stop prompting me with risk detections and with MFA prompts as it learns. So many of you who may have been around for a while may be familiar with these two blades in identity protection on our portal. So introduced in 2016, this was really revolutionary for the time. But we had legacy identity protection policies. So you could set a user risk policy or a sign-in risk policy, but all you could do was require MFA or password change. It only worked for sign-in and user risk. You couldn't use report-only mode. We had limited sign-in logging. It couldn't integrate with authentication context or any of the other goodness that we have from across the company with our detections and remediation. So don't use this if you see it. We will be depreciating this on October 1st, 2026, so in a few years. So if you currently have these legacy policies enabled on your tenant, we recommend going in and just shifting them over to conditional access. It's super easy. We will show you how to do that in a minute here. And then if you see these, we have this big banner, don't create new ones. So this is kind of a call to action to move to conditional access if you have these legacy policies enabled. So risk-based conditional access, if you're unfamiliar with conditional access, here's kind of what it looks like. You can go in, create a policy for sign-in risk or user risk. You can set it to your specified risk level based off your organization's risk tolerance, and then require MFA for sign-in risk or require a password reset for user risk. You can also, as you see at the bottom here, set this in report-only mode. So you can have this policy running in the background, not disrupting any users, but kind of reporting what would have happened if it were to be on. So before you deploy, you can have this all going, so you're really confident whenever you hit that create button on your CA policy and this goes live. So what access controls are available? I just mentioned, you can use risk levels and, resetting password and providing MFA, but because we are in conditional access, you have access to a plethora of different kind of knobs and Lego bricks you can move around to create the policy that is right for your organization. So going through here, you can set your preferred risk level based off of your risk tolerance, as well as authentication strengths. Maybe if a user is coming in with low risk, but they're using phishing resistant MFA, that's a bit more trustworthy than it would be if they weren't. And you can also set these kind of for remediation as well. But yeah, we have because we're integrated with conditional access and we have all these resources from across Microsoft, we can really plug in and build your perfect little Lego tower with whatever access policies and controls that you want with conditional access, which I think is fantastic. One thing we want to let you all know about is because these risk-based conditional access policies are so important, and Microsoft really wants our users and customers to be secure by default. So making it as easy as possible for the security level of your organization to be pretty high. So one thing we started, I believe last year we started rolling these out, but it's Microsoft managed policies. These are predefined conditional access policies provided by Microsoft to help secure your organization's resources with pretty much no or minimal effort from you. So these are kind of our biggest recommendations that we have, that we think, if we roll them out for you, it'll have a limited amount of impact to your users whenever they're deployed. So these are created by Microsoft. We are continuously going through and making new policies and tweaking the current ones to enhance them as new threats come available. We've seen dramatically decreased compromise rates with tenants with these managed policies enabled, and they're also customizable. So whenever you get a managed policy rollout for your tenant, you'll get a little banner that'll pop up and say, hey, you have a managed policy that's going to be enabled soon. As an admin, you can go in, you can turn that off, or you can customize it. So if you have certain users that you don't want to be included in the policy, you can exclude them. or add any of those additional building blocks as needed. The current risk-based conditional access managed policy, we only have one for risk-based conditional access at the moment, is requiring multi-factor authentication and re-authentication for high-risk sign-ins. So this is kind of at the bare minimum for conditional access what we're looking at. So whenever Microsoft has super high confidence that a sign-in is risky, just making that user do multi-factor authentication. These are something that we have seen great success with kind of elevating the security posture in among all of our customers. And so we highly recommend you keep an eye out for this, but don't let these managed policies stop you from creating your own in the meantime. And I'll pass back to Rashi to tell you how to get ready to deploy in the meantime.
Thank you, Megan. So deploying these policies is straightforward. If you go on the next slide, in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center, you can quickly set up policies requiring MFA for risky sign-ins and password changes for high-risky users. On the next slide here, I have a demo. So we'll click through this demo real quick. So you log into your Microsoft Entra Admin portal. You click on the Protection tab, and then Conditional Access, Policies, add new policies from a template, and click on the Risky Sign-In policy. It's all the way in the bottom. Now, once I click on this, I'm prompted to configure the basic settings for the template. Next, we'll configure the access controls for this policy. And once I have really double-checked everything, I'll set the enable policy to report only mode for testing, as Megan had mentioned earlier. I'll click create to save the policy. Now I can click and go back and enforce this policy to on. And here's an example of us just doing that. And that shows you that this policy is on. Now, going to the next slide, Microsoft recommends secure password change with multi-factor authentication as a conditional access control if a high user risk is triggered. Microsoft recommends to require MFA with a sign-in frequency of every time as a conditional access control if a medium or a high sign-in risk is triggered. Let's move on to the next slide. Now that
All
right. Let's move on to the next slide as well. Now that we understand that, how deployment works, what are the templates, we also understand that deployment takes time, right? It takes change management, sometimes very careful scrutiny by the leadership team in order to understand any unwanted impact. And we give administrators the power of confidently providing these answers to those scenarios to adopt risk-based policies needed to protect the environment. So you can use this impact analysis workbook or report, which lets you view the impact immediately based on sign-in logs. Now, the only prerequisite here is that your sign-in logs need to be sent to the log analytics workspace, and we'll make sure to share a link for you to dive deeper into this workbook. So what's next? Here's a step-by-step approach of implementing Entra ID protection. You configure SSPR and MFA for all users. Now, these prerequisites need to be configured to enable self-remediation, which we highlighted in the beginning of the presentation, which is crucial for efficient risk management with good users. You create conditional access policies in report-only mode. Now, start by setting these policies in report-only mode to build a baseline of normal activity without really impacting your users and admins, and let it run for 5 days and gather the data. Use the impact analysis report to further understand your data. Now you can convert your sign-in risk policy to on, similarly to what we showed in the demo. Once you've gathered enough data, switch the policy to on, enforce MFA for medium or high-risk users, and similarly switch the user risk policy to on and require secure password changes with MFA for high-risk users. Continuously provide feedback to the learning models by confirming risk events or marking false positives in the admin portal. As a reminder, we mentioned there are 3 different generated sources for signals, and this is one of the third signal score And this is very crucial for us. So please provide feedback to the learning models by confirming risk events. And this really helps us reduce the potential of false positives and improves the overall accuracy of the system. Now, gradually scope these policies to all users. I think recommend starting with a smaller group and then expanding so that there is less change management and it's easier for deployments. All right, I think with that, we conclude our presentation for today, and we'd like to open it up for some Q&As.
Thank you so much. For those of y'all who are tuning in live, feel free to pop your questions in the live Q&A. We would love to hear from you as to different things you want to discuss here or questions you have for our speakers. I'll start off with a few things just because they have been on my mind while y'all have been presenting. The biggest one is, this is all really exciting to see, but oftentimes if I were a customer, I would then be thinking, okay, how much is this going to cost me? So could you please give clarity on what the licensing structure would look like and how I would go about licensing it for my organization?
Yes, we actually have a slide prepared in case we got that question. Rashi, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So for the risk-based conditional access, it's part of the Entra ID Protection P2 license. And in fact, it's also a part of the Microsoft Entra suite. So you have private access, internet access, ID governance, verified ID premium, as well as identity protection. So it's part of the Entra suite as well as the P2 license.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that. I know that on the licensing front, you also mentioned Microsoft managed policies. So if I'm using this as a Microsoft managed policy, do I need to be licensed separately, or are managed policies available to me in the free SKU?
I can take that one. So Microsoft managed policies are utilizing risk-based conditional access. So you would need the P2 license or Entra suite to be able to get those Microsoft managed policies.
Okay, good to know. I appreciate it, because I was just like, how would I use it? But that's really helpful. I love the idea of Microsoft managed policies, especially with them being customizable. I didn't know you can customize them, so this was really helpful for me to learn. I did have another question on some of the risk levels. I know you touched on them earlier, but I was wondering if you could please recap for some of our viewers on those various risk levels and what it truly means to be high risk, medium risk, low risk, because sometimes we see that and there might be a disconnect between the meaning and what you should be doing as an admin.
Yeah, so our risk levels, they translate to how confident Microsoft is that an attack is taking place. So our low risk is kind of our lowest confidence. We see some anomalies, but we don't really want to kind of like raise all the red flags and defenses. High risk means that we are like very confident that something fishy is happening, an attacker may be trying to get in. So that's kind of a misconception with our risk policies, is they're not directly towards the like significance of the or severity of the attack, but more towards the confidence Microsoft has. So that's why for our sign-in based policy suggestion and our best practice, we say high and medium risk, because that'll have minimal disruption for users, and you'll still kind of get that protection. But for our Microsoft managed policies, we're only kind of doing that very baseline, which is the high sign-in risk. Low risks are great for detecting anomalies. And if you're going to be exporting this data to a SIEM or something similar, utilizing Sentinel, those are great to kind of tie all the pieces together for a larger attack. But those we see are a bit more noisy because we're kind of flagging things that are a little fishy, but not quite what we think is the level of a full compromise. So those are great for investigation, but not necessarily the policies.
Gotcha. I love how you explained it as a confidence score. I feel like that makes so much sense when chatting with folks who haven't leveraged this before on how to effectively use it. And really appreciate what you're saying about everybody having a different risk tolerance, right? I know some organizations, given the nature of their business or the nature of certain groups of users, are wanting to just lock everything down. If it's low risk, still lock it down or still prompt for MFA, of course, depending on their personal risk tolerance. But of course, in other organizations, it makes sense to not disrupt the flow of business. And I also know that you mentioned giving feedback to the ML model of how you would go through and say, hey, this is, not something I consider risky. Could you elaborate on that one more time for our listeners? Because I do think that's a great point, especially for things like impossible travel. Years ago, I worked with a customer, and this was brand new when RBCA first came out. They were an airline, and for some of the travel bits, it would flag as atypical for a user to be signing in from all around the world, but that's a normal day for a pilot or a flight attendant or an individual who has flight benefits or working for the company. So could you please speak to some of the responses that you can give back to Microsoft to better inform our models on how a user should be flagged?
Yeah, so whenever we built these ML models, we kind of looked at the population as a whole. So we didn't really look based off of, is this specific tenant, an airline and they're flying all over, their employees are flying all over. So overall, like in the general population, if someone's bouncing around from place to place, like that's kind of suspicious. But as Bailey mentioned, we do have, we have customers who are doing that. They're truck drivers going around the country or pilots and flying back and forth. So that is, that's something that whenever we brought in, the giving feedback back to Microsoft, it was to kind of combat that. So if my tenant, if I'm doing something that Microsoft as a whole is like, this is kind of suspicious for a normal thing to do, that's whenever you can bring in that feedback and tell us like, nope, actually for our users, this is perfectly normal. And then we'll learn from that so that it more tailors our policies and our ML model to your specific tenant and your specific users. So that is, something pretty new on taking that feedback and integrating into the ML model. I believe we released that within the last year. So if you are not currently doing that for your organization, highly recommend going in and as you're investigating these risks, confirming safe or confirming compromised, because that'll, just make the whole experience more tailored for your organization.
Love that. And thank you for sharing. I feel like that customization is really helpful for, getting all of that out the door. I did have another question that came in on timelines. So I know we briefly touched on a moment ago about the Microsoft managed policies and how those would be working for users. Can you elaborate more on the policy timelines for that and how they could go about leveraging them and deploying them? Rashi, do you want to take that one by chance?
Yep. So Microsoft will enable these policies after no less than 90 days after they are introduced in your tenants if they're left in report-only state. Now, administrators might choose the option to either turn on the policies on sooner before that 90-day period or opt out of the policy by setting the policy state to off. And customers are notified via emails and message center post 28 days before the policies are enabled. I believe there are about 3 notifications that go through the customers in this 90-day period. And customers are notified both via emails and the message center posts.
Gotcha. And thank you for that. There was a question that came in from one of our audience members as well on, they refer to it as functional accounts. So I'm assuming they mean workload identities, but if I'm making an incorrect assumption, please let me know in the chat. Questions about how we can effectively use risk policies for those workload identity or non-human accounts. Megan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So for our workload identities, we do have a SKU for that using risk-based conditional access for the risks we're finding with these like non-human workload identity accounts. So for those, the detections come in, and because of the nature, they can't really do self-remediation. So we recommend blocking those accounts when we see risk. So I highly recommend looking into our workload identity SKU. That is where you will find that all those controls for non-human accounts. And we do recommend the risk-based conditional access and blocking those accounts when we see risk. This is something that we released a handful of years ago, and we're currently, building a lot more for those. So be on the lookout for new features in our workload identity risk detection area coming soon.
Thank you for that. And one more question on the licensing front. I know earlier we recapped the licensing structure for RBCA. And somebody was asking, what are the best recommendations for users who are currently Enter ID P1 and plan to stay at P1 for some time? So what are some other compensating controls or features they can leverage to be able to get a similar impact in their environment? Megan, I know you know a lot about the licensing bit, so would you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take this one. So P1 is kind of interesting. It doesn't include our risk-based policies, so you don't kind of get that goodness of risk-based conditional access. But we do have limited risk reporting in Entra ID protection for P1. So you're still able to go in and see if users are at risk and then manually take those actions of resetting the password. So this is a bit more investigations heavy, a bit more manpower that you need for P1, but definitely also go through and investigate those users. Yeah, you can't do the automatic remediation. It is a bit more hand-holdy that you have to do to the system, but we highly recommend you going through and investigating those risks as well.
Absolutely, and thank you for that, Megan. I know that there's also some great resources if folks look up our security and operations guide that we put on MS Learn a couple years ago. And it goes through, different controls you can leverage. And I believe it has all budgets listed out of different things and different actions that you can take in order to, reduce risk in your environment. So hopefully that's a helpful resource for folks. I do know that we're coming up on time, but really thank you for everybody for joining us today. And thank you to Rashi Kuke and Megan Walsh for being able to talk about risk-based conditional access. For folks who did find this helpful and perhaps are listening to the recording on YouTube, please share it with a colleague so that way other folks can benefit from content like this. And please let us know what you would like to see out of the show. We're very much trying to align with what our listeners are looking for from a technical content perspective. I know RBCA was something that was very requested, but especially as we're closing down for the holidays, post-Ignite, looking at what might be helpful from an Ignite announcement perspective to dive more deeply into, especially now that we're coming up on the new year. So ideally, we would love to do more of these shows and keep this going. So if you do like it, please give us a thumbs up on YouTube, share it with everyone that you might find benefit from, share it on LinkedIn, reach out to our speakers on LinkedIn. They love to hear from you and love to hear thank yous for their presentations today. And with that, I'm looking forward to seeing y'all in our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.